First, just want to start off by saying thank you to the presenters again, that there was a lot of comments in the chat giving you both kudos for taking a tremendous amount of content that is really complicated and distilling it into really approachable concepts. So great job. I think everyone got a lot out of that. We do have a number of questions, both in the Q&A and chat. We'll try to get through all of them. If we are unable to get through your questions, this is a very approachable group. Reach out to people directly, the Portage Network, Matthew, James, everyone here is really open to having these conversations and helping. So we do apologize if we're not able to get to your questions today, but we will make sure that in the future we can. And so starting off down the list, Chantel had a question noting that some funding calls are already asking for applications to demonstrate incorporating open science principles, practices, and tools into their work, including the FAIR data principles, in their knowledge translation and mobilization plan. Now, she's asking about the relationship between FAIR data in their knowledge mobilization plans and DMPs. And then she dropped this link comparing just a study that she was referencing. But James, I might guide this one to you, talking about that relationship between FAIR data and DMPs, because I know that this is something I've heard you speak about in the past.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Chantel. I don't know if there's cookie cutter answers to everything, but certainly I think about how we can implement FAIR data. I'm involved in the work at the University of Alberta on our development of our own institutional research data management strategy, and very much, FAIR data and the principles of that and the notions of it are baked into, the principles that we're working from, and as we inform moving forward with our work. So I think just thinking about FAIR data and what that means, the findability, accessibility, interoperability, the reuse of the data at the front end of any given project is important. And I think that a lot of the notions of that are, again, baked into the data management plan templates, with the questions that are being asked, and with the guidance that's being provided. And let's face it, the easy part is not then filling out, right? They don't fill themselves out. We're not quite there yet with machine actionable DMPs, but we say that tongue in cheek. We want folks to be able to think about their projects and think about the specifics and the context. And so think about what FAIR data means to you, what it means to your project, and how your project might be able to support that. And there's lots of different models and different flavors for different types of projects, because there's lots of nuances and lots of complexity. So I'm always of the mind that every project deserves to be thought about in that way, to have focus on it, thinking about those things, and going from there. So I don't know if that's really answering, but just again thinking about it ahead of time and thinking about FAIR ahead of time. Now, if there's opportunities moving forward to more directly build FAIR principles into DMP templates, into guidance, then I think that's great. And I think that's some of what we might want to look at and think about as things evolve. Because as far along as we've come, and especially in the last few years, I think we can agree that we're still pretty early on, relatively speaking, into the data management planning component, research data management, and things are going to evolve and mature moving forward.
That's great, James. And just Chantel typed some clarification into that as you were speaking. And she was really asking about the potential redundancy between DMPs and knowledge mobilization plans when it comes to data plans. And so I don't know if you want to add anything extra to that, or Matthew, if you want to jump into that, but I think redundancy across these type of things for applications is something that a lot of people are thinking about.
I can just say quickly, we'll obviously have to try to avoid that at all costs. People's time is very precious, and making them fill the same thing out twice is not in anyone's interest. I would also just say, although the policy itself is not an open data policy, that does not preclude the agencies requiring open data in certain funding opportunities. And you saw that in some of the COVID opportunities that emerged, where openness was either required or strongly encouraged. So the policy itself doesn't require it, but there could be instances in which the agencies do.
Yeah, and I'll just expand. I agree, number one, Chantal, with what you're saying, and echo Matthew's comments. I'm also in one way of mind that I don't mind redundancy in philosophy to some degrees too. Like, it's okay to think about things in more than once, the same way in more than one stages. And if there's the opportunity, at the earliest stage, if the DMP is the earliest stage, and you're thinking about those things there, and you're able to, you know, take the information that you've been able to apply to it and move it forward into, you know, a knowledge mobilization strategy. Or, you know, I've been involved in lots of health research where we have integrated knowledge translation components and working with the, you know, the stakeholders and the sectors and such. Then I would have liked to go back in time, to be quite honest, and have a DMP back for some of those. I might have a little few less gray hairs that you see here from our lessons learned, and to be able to have actually some of that redundancy to bring it forward. So.
That's awesome. And yeah, if anyone has any clarification questions, comments, please drop them in the chat. And so moving on to a question from Michelle, she's asking about the timelines for the introduction of DMP requirements at the application stage and at the funding programs initially selected. And will they take into account the consideration, the need for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities to co-develop DMPs for research that involves their communities? I'm not sure who wants to take this one first. Matthew, I chose James last time. I'll give you the questions.
It's probably appropriate that I address this one. So first of all, let me just say that any requirements that in our new policy are consistent with the requirements that already exist within the TCPS2, the Tri-Council Policy Statement 2, developed by the Secretary for the Responsible Conduct of Research, which provides guidance and lays out requirements for how researchers engage with Indigenous communities they are working with. And so from the perspective of needing to work according to principles accepted by those communities and recognizing that those data management policies will evolve over time, we continue to expect researchers will engage and discuss with their Indigenous partners. If the question is more specific, as it may be about simply the time between launch and application deadline, and recognizing that more time is needed indeed to develop a data management plan with an Indigenous partner to ensure that what one is laying out in that plan is accepted by the Indigenous partner. We will definitely have to keep that in mind moving forward. I can't promise that the timelines will always be lengthy to allow as much time as one might like to allow. Sometimes timelines are given to us in ways we would rather avoid and don't have much of a choice with, but we will certainly need to keep that in mind. And I think as we move forward and work with Indigenous communities and groups like the First Nations Information Governance Center to develop processes for Indigenous communities, we expect that those discussions and engagements will become easier over time. But certainly, Indigenous communities need to be in the leadership seat when it comes to determining how they wish to have their data governed.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And I think, yeah, it's going to be coming down the pipe as time marches on. We see how things go. Matthew, we have another question that is directed to you, and it's asking about how disciplinary differences might come into DMP adjudication, noting some disciplines have established practices like biology, some are just kind of learning this thing, and if you can speak to that at all.
Great question. And it comes back to the fact that the agencies aren't marking these DMPs. Your merit review committees will be adjudicating the DMPs. So it will be how one's peers view one's proposal to manage the data. If that's acceptable to a committee focused on biology, or if it's acceptable to a committee of sociologists, or acceptable to a committee of art historians, then they will take that into account when including that and reviewing the DMP and including that in the mark that they give the application. To be clear, we're not at this time proposing kind of a pass-fail type of approach. We're proposing to have this integrated largely within the methodology of the application in that section, so it would be included in the mark that's given for that section. But we're not going to prescribe how a researcher manages their data. That is going to be up to the adjudication committee. We're simply saying that you need to explain to the adjudication committee how you plan to manage your data.
Yeah, that's very fair. And there is just a comment that there's probably going to be an education piece from the agencies
Absolutely.
to the institutions and what that will look like. Can you speak to if there's any plans for something like that, or is that still kind of being developed as these conversations are happening?
Well, in terms of merit review, we will definitely need to work with the adjudication committees in that first few years to help them understand for those who don't already, what a data management plan is, some things they may wish to be looking for in a data management plan. Again, we won't tell them you have to check all these boxes, but these are some of the things you need to think about. And without doubt, disciplinary cultures will evolve over time, and the standards for what is good data management in biology or art history will evolve over time, and it will evolve from the perspective of the research community itself, not from dictates from the granting agencies. In regards to, and I'm sorry, I didn't see the actual question, but in regards to working with institutions and the evolution of data management practices, that's just going to be part of a bigger question that the whole ecosystem and all the parts are going to play. I would think that the Digital Alliance is going to play a big role, the RDM side of that, in working with institutions to understand how data management practices are evolving and what good and best practices are on that front. Oh, you're on mute, Nick.
I know, right? After a year and a half, still doing it. So yeah, keeping the ball in your court, Matthew, just answering the questions as they came in order, but noting that a full DMP is an extensive and living document. And they're asking, is the expectation that the DMP requirement for selected funding opportunities, will it require an overview or highlights of a DMP, or actually the completed document?
So put yourself in the seat of an adjudication member. What information would you like to see from a DMP coming to you? And so we recognize some information won't be determined, just as other parts of an application or project plan may still be up in the air. But you'll need to provide the information that a committee would need to determine if you're going to manage your data appropriately. Now, I recognize that's a bit of a vague response, but honestly, it just comes down to expectations of adjudication members within a certain disciplinary context, and that will evolve over time.
Awesome. Now, another question about approval. I think that's mainly been answered, but please, to that person, if they haven't, type it into the chat. Moving on, there's a question from Eugene about the DMP assistant support for authentications like CAF and Shibboleth for Canadian schools. Been talking about it since 2014, just wondering if something like that is on the radar. And I think, James, that's probably a good question for you.
Yeah, thanks, Eugene, for the question. And I'm actually gonna cheat a little bit, because I noticed that my colleague Robin Nicholson, who is the Portage DMP coordinator, is on the call, and so it's just a nice opportunity to introduce her and completely put her on the spot to see if she wants to field this question. But I'm happy to speak to it as well.
Hi, thanks so much, James.
Anytime, Robin.
So for those of you who I might not know, I'm Robin Nicholson. I'm the Data Management Planning Coordinator with Portage, now the Alliance RDM. I've held this position since October of last year. So the Shibboleth question is a big one on our side as well. We have a change request registry that is internal to our service team, where we keep track of all the requests that come in and prioritize based on developing capacity and shifting timelines. So that Shibboleth authentication piece is certainly among the high priorities for us. In terms of timelines, we don't have an exact one yet, but essentially from the technical perspective, all the pieces are in place. It does require some configuration. It also requires some more administrative action in terms of achieving the right agreements with different institutions to put that authentication process in place. But yeah, definitely on our radar as well, hopefully sooner rather than later. And James, feel free to add anything that I may have missed.
I think that's great. Thanks, Sean.
Great to hear that that's on the horizon. Now, moving on to the next question, will institutional admins have access to the same training that the adjudication committees receive, so that our researchers are guided well before the DMPs arrive? I think this speaks to some things that we were talking about earlier about that education piece and including everyone in those conversations.
Yeah, I can take the first response to this. I think the short answer is yes. To be honest, I think we're developing lots of resources with it in mind that different perspectives, whether you're on an adjudication committee, review committee, if you're the researcher, as examples, you might have some different perspectives and different ways of needing to look at things, and maybe different types of resources are nuanced to help support that. But by and large, I mean, I think this is, this is open data, this is open access. We want everybody to have all of the information available. Nothing should be a secret. So when we think about that effective guide for developing a DMP and all those things I kind of briefly ran through, which is really kind of tailored to a researcher's perspective, thinking about what your project is and what your data, we can take some of that now and actually that's some of our next steps, is evolve that into something that can be used for somebody reviewing. So now when you're reviewing, think about some of these things. And again, it gets into kind of the quality of the information in there. And Matthew nailed it on the head, is that, we're not prescribing that this is the way to manage your data. This is where you need to store your data or how you document your data. That's up to the adjudication committee, and they're already, presumably, have expertise in lots of those areas as well. But this is the place where you can capture that information and give it to them in a way that hopefully supports, the process for adjudication, for funding, but also the research. Ultimately, I mean, that's what we're here for.
And I just add, any tools that we develop, we will be making them open, without doubt.
And so working with that tool, that I think this is a great question, and I think you answered it a bit, but someone was asking if there's going to be some kind of rubric for DMP compliance with the tri-agency requirements. They referenced a link that I can drop in the chat. I don't know of any efforts like that. Matthew or James, do you know of anything like that, or is that in the works?
I'll just say we haven't explicitly said you have to use this template or you answer these questions, but if I'm not mistaken, the policy does point to what was then the Portage DMP assistant as a great tool to use when developing a DMP. So we would encourage researchers to use that tool, but we're not requiring, at this point, not requiring them to use that tool.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. James, anything to add, or is that cover it?
I think that that generally covers it. We hope our intent is to have what we hope to be considered a gold standard platform that Canadian researchers can use. And there's other platforms out there. We should mention the DMP assistant really is in many ways benefit from international work that we have with folks happening at the Digital Curation Center in California Digital Library. But we recognize that we have unique contexts here in Canada, and we need to have a platform that addresses the specific things that we need to think about here, as well as a fully, bilingual platform as well. So that's, hopefully what we've done and continue to do. But as Matthew said, there's not a prescribed requirement that you have to use this platform or you have to use X, Y, or Z template. I think the short answer to the question is yes. I think there will be some work moving forward around, developing more resources, things like helping folks review DMPs, helping researchers understand what makes a good DMP. And we're all learning, I think, as this landscape evolves. It still is relatively young. So I hope that when we look back, in another 5 years from now, look backwards, that we'll see a tremendous amount of progress in that respect.
Awesome. I'm going to collapse a few different questions here, but there's a lot of curiosity around Indigenous data management and all of this. And there's questions around helping Indigenous communities to reflect upon what they want in a DMP. Will there be templates around those? But also asking that, because there might be limited resources in these communities, what adjudication might look like for that, maybe initially and down the road. And so I know that's a bit of a loaded question, but I can see the answer kind of leading into one another. So I think, Matthew, I saw you unmute yourself, so take at it.
Sure. Regarding supports for Indigenous organizations or communities, we encourage them to apply to our Connection Grant competition. I believe the call actually explicitly encourages Indigenous communities and organizations to apply to that as some support for coming together to discuss what data management means for them. We realize it's not enough, but it is some. On top of that, though, we're going to be working with organizations such as the First Nations Information Governance Center, such as ITK and other organizations, to understand what role we can play, because the decision around what is appropriate data management for Indigenous organizations and communities needs to be made by those communities. They need to be in the leadership seat on having those conversations and leading those conversations. So we want to be there to support, to facilitate, but it is not necessarily our role it is not our role to lead those conversations. So we are starting to engage more fully with organizations and would be happy to have conversations with any to understand how we can support those questions, while also recognizing a lot of work has been done with OCAP. A lot of work has been done with the CARE principles internationally as well. And many communities have very sophisticated approaches to data already, and those communities can offer a hand to others that are looking to improve their own or to develop their own standards.
Yeah, that's great.
And sorry, there was a follow-up question around, I guess it was around Indigenous organizations or researchers in those organizations that might be applying to the agencies for funding, and the question of if they do not have the resources they need to develop what one might consider effective data management plans. There are other one of the things we need to consider as we try to make funding opportunities open to Indigenous organizations and communities is the need to create a level playing field, and data management plans are only one of a number of issues that come there. And so, yes, one would need to take account of both of different ways of knowing and different ways of adjudication and different ways of approaching research, as well as perhaps different ways of managing data and the resources that are available to do that. As I would say right now, Indigenous organizations that are managing agency funds do not at this point need to create a strategy. And by saying this point, I'm not suggesting we're going to change that in the future. I'm just suggesting that they are not required to create a strategy for managing research data in the same way that post-secondary institutions and research hospitals are. That requirement is for post-secondary institutions and research hospitals.
Awesome. And this, I think that kind of segues into another question about Indigenous research, and it's asking about the expectations from the tri-agency in regards to how they're going to reference, support, and partner with both Indigenous researchers and Indigenous communities. I think a lot of people want to do this, but the where to start angle and what could be expected both in the short term and long term would be very valuable to hear people and what your thoughts are on that.
I know there are a number of questions, so I'm not sure if I'm addressing the right one. I'll just say, and I'm not in a position to tell researchers how to develop or to effectively engage with Indigenous communities, but recognizing you need to effectively engage and communicate and view these communities and individuals as equal partners in this work, and listen is obviously the key. And this is all keeping with the Tri-Council policy statement on good research ethics and good research approaches. I know there's a question here around what the expectations are for institutions in their institutional strategies. Our requirement states you need to recognize the need for research to be done or data to be managed in accordance with principles. We don't say that the institutions themselves need to engage and help Indigenous communities develop those protocols. We know many have strong relationships with Indigenous communities, and that's fantastic, and there's probably work that can be done there. But the policy itself does not require post-secondary institutions to take the leadership on that work, but it does require them to recognize that research needs to be managed in accordance with those principles.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think as the conversations keep going, people can help support each other. But yeah, I think something that we just need to keep talking about it. And so in moving forward, someone's asking specifically about the wording in the policy and the commitment to the adoption of established best practices when developing institutional standards and specifically policies around data management plans, and asking about the expectations to develop local campus policies related to DMPs.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I realize that point could be misinterpreted. We are not requiring institutions to develop policies for data management plans for all research that's taking place at those institutions. Only that they seek to establish and implement best practices as best they're able when developing in support of their researchers. So we recognize that research funding comes from a variety of sources, and we are not requiring that, all research be conducted, or that all research carried out within an institution have data management plans attached to them. That's not part of the requirement of this policy, if that's what that question was getting at.
Yeah, and for the person who asked that, please feel free to ask for clarification, but I think that was a good job in tackling it. This person is asking about clinical data from an institutional perspective, and that there has been acknowledging the repurposing and the reuse of that type of research data, that there's been a reluctance to allow preservation with no limitation in time. And just, can you expand on what this might mean for institutions and how they might begin thinking about that type of thing?
I may turn to James to answer this, but I'll just say again, how long and what type of data one needs to keep and maintain will need to be developed by the communities that are involved there. But we recognize that one can't keep, as James said, all their data all the time. That's not realistic. So communities will need to determine what makes sense within their context.
Yeah, echoing what Matthew says, and I by no means have specific expertise in clinical research, but have some generalist experience, and again just working with in health research and various clinicians and research that are involved in it. I recognize that we have different nuances around different types of data, and clinical research is certainly one of them, and how we may look to effectively manage them, and that goes well beyond the end of the project. And Matthew's, I think, correct in that, in terms of what best practices are, in terms of requirements, even in italics with quotations, soft requirements, the things that we're looking to do with any given data. I think those really need to be generated within the communities of research. They should have efficacy over, what is appropriate, what best practices mean as they evolve. I think these are the types of things that we look to make sure that we're bookmarking and addressing within institutional strategies, which is what this week is about thinking about, starting to launch some of that work. Some institutions are already well on their way, some are just starting, and working with the different offices on campus. So thinking like, research ethics, and thinking about research services and such, how do we look to support that? Again, it might not be that, coming from a DMP assistant perspective, as an example, we're not here to prescribe what the rules are, and we're not going to say this is how you should do things, beyond general best practices around fair data and things like that to keep in mind. But ultimately, decisions are going to be made in accordance with requirements, and those requirements can come from different places, like the institutional strategies, the funder requirements, institutional requirements. So I think there's opportunities to engage in these conversations and think about them moving forward. Which I've, one of my earliest career lessons was you can't solve problems you can't talk about. So if we can even identify by nature of all this work that's being put into development of strategies, by some of the requirements that are coming down, they're forcing us to think about these things. I think those are good things, and nothing's going to happen overnight. There's culture change and there's complexities to it, but it's all hopefully moving forward in positive ways to benefit the research, and appropriately managing the data beyond just the immediate project.
No, that was a great answer from both of you. And before this slips by into the now novel that's the chat box, I do want to just to say that, Matthew, all these expectations that you've outlined from the agencies are really appreciated by people. And there was the question, would there be a summary of writing for this so people could easily refer and share this? I'm not sure if that's a plan of yours.
That's great. I was just going to actually refer to that. I see one of my team has already responded to say they'd be happy to respond in writing. I have asked the team to try to capture these questions so we can respond to some questions that we don't get a chance to answer today. But also I would point you to our FAQs that are linked to our policy. Those are an evergreen document. As new questions come up, we're putting new answers in the FAQs. And I think all, or at least most of what I've said today should be captured in those FAQs to some degree.
That's awesome. Thanks for answering that, Alex. I didn't see the chat. I just wanted to freeze it so I didn't lose track of everything. Okay, so this next question is extremely long. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but they are asking about resourcing for supportive DMPs on an institutional scale, and how there's different kind of models that, is there training for researchers for them to do it themselves? Will there be a central kind of office for people to get support, dedicated staff or faculty, fee-for-service operation? And I think it's just looking for some guidance in what you've seen as effective or how this might be led. James, I haven't heard from you in a bit.
Yeah,
I told you I'd give you the hard questions.
No, it's a great question. It's one I thought about earlier in my career before I got more heavily involved directly with, DMPs and DMP assistant, and also just having early conversations for those of us who've been involved in RDM for any length of time. You know, I had a wonderful mentor and predecessor here in Chuck Humphrey at the University of Alberta, and used to, you know, knock all these ideas around and talk about them. You know, this is an evolving landscape, and I know I've said this a number of times. I don't want to sound like a broken record or have a politician's answer, but you know, it really is. And in terms of, you know, these questions, they're good questions to have. I really think this is part of what, in part, the institutional strategy development can help to look to address. Any given institution should be thinking about these things. If you want to even just keep it simple and think about, you know, the three pillars of the Try and See policy. Well, you're working on the strategy. There's pillar 1, pillar 2, and 3 speak directly about, you know, applied things like data management plans and like data deposit. And then, you know, naturally you have these conversations. How are we going to support these? How are we going to support, you know, the implementation of data management plans? How are we going to support researchers in attaining their knowledge and experience with developing them? How are we going to, you know, effectively support research and research excellence at our institution? And so some institutions, you know, have more or less resources as well. And those resources can come in lots of ways, not just financially, in having folks on campus that have expertise to some degree in these areas or not, you know, and so we want for institutions, you know, ideally to be able to, again, have efficacy, have ownership over how they are supporting researchers and to effectively meet, you know, impending requirements, but also just the principles of open science and FAIR principles and so forth. And if they, you know, come up with solutions at their own institutions to kind of have niche, dedicated, you know, resources in the form of training materials, resources, webinars, expertise, you know, those types of things as part of their development implementation of their strategies, and that's fantastic. But recognizing that, again, not all institutions are operating on the same level. You know, we've got colleges and small to medium to large institutions all across in lots of different areas of focus. And for those that maybe can't come up with some and deliver some of those niche services and resources, if not, you know, in long term, but even immediately, then we want the entities like the Portages, like the RDM Alliance, you know, to be able to continue to produce good resources that are available to everyone bilingually, and hopefully will provide some assistance at these early stages and beyond. And again, you know, I kind of think about, here's our current state and where's our future state going. I really am optimistic that we're going to look backwards in that 3 to 5 years from now too, and just see how much has happened and where we are in terms of supporting research here in Canada, both at that national level and as well as at our individual organizations and institutions. If it wasn't by design that I got into research data management, it wasn't what I went into school for. But I tell you, if I had to go back in time and tell my future self where there was some good jobs and really, you know, opportunities and exciting work, I ended up landing in a pretty good place, and really happy to be here with it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think a lot of people on this call are interested in how they can support, and, you know, how you got here is always an interesting thing. I don't think there was a lot of linear paths for people in these roles. And so this is an interesting question. And James, I'm going to ask you this question, but noting that there are some other Portage people lurking in the background, they can jump in as well. But if there's any plans to integrate the DMP into any research occurring via the Endrio platforms?
Yeah, I mean, this probably goes into some of what Robin spoke to a bit around the registry we have of requests for work that comes through the DMP, relating directly to DMP, and we discussed those on the steering committee. I mentioned one of my latter slides. It seems that we, again, always seem to have an infinite number of things we could be working on and finite time and resources. So it's important to prioritize and to strategize. And, you know, some things sound really easy and they're difficult. And then some things sound difficult to me. And I find out afterwards, talking to the technical folks under the hood that make, you know, this thing run, that they're actually easier. So, you know, I think that we're quite open to that. So like, again, implementing, having connections with things like potentially, you know, further the Federated Research Data Repository. Nick, I won't scoop ideas. You and I and many others have been talking about some things as well. So maybe there'll be some announcements down the road, funding opportunities. But yeah, I mean, we're wide open. We want to be able to give folks options, and I think that's one of the things that I really love about the landscape today. Like, I have been involved in RDM for the better part of 20 years, and if you go back to the early days, I mean, there was very little options for researchers. You know, you go back 10 years ago, there wasn't a DMP assistant. You go back, you know, 10, 15 years ago, there was very few repository options, and that's very different than what we have today. And I really like that researchers have choices and, again, have efficacy over how they support their data management. I think that's really important, having spent, you know, the brunt of my career in soft grant funded environments and working with researchers and been down in the data, you know, the research trenches, so to speak. So yeah, we want to support that moving forward. And reading tea leaves, I think the short answer is yes, and then we'll see exactly, you know, where all those opportunities land and what we can do to support it.
You heard it here first, folks. The answer is yes, and we'll see. So now this is an interesting question, because I think a lot of what we've been talking about so far has been about managing data, but this person's asking about the DMP in regards to software. And that, as we all know, software needs caring, patches, environments, licensing, renewal. And the idea of sharing data and software after a project is completed in a few years doesn't speak to the decay of the software and infrastructure. And so it's asking what should be included in a DMP and to how to get the project up and running a couple years down the road. James, as the DMP person, I might pass this one to you, but I understand that this is kind of a new frontier in terms of what data management really entails.
Yeah, I'll try to answer that, and certainly if I and for any given question, if we haven't sufficiently answered, feel free to reach out to us afterwards as well. But I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question. So again, can you just repeat, because I'm not seeing it in the chat straight up, Nick. Are we talking about software as in the DMP assistant software, or software within any given research project?
Software within a given research project.
Okay.
Thank you, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. She's like the voice from above, the voice of reason came in. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I honestly right off the bat have a great answer to that one. I mean, that is some of the realities of what we work in. The great thing about technology is it allows us to do all these wonderful things, but then there's challenges with it, and thinking about, you know, technology these day and ages, the latest and greatest software becomes, you know, yesterday's software fairly quickly, so to speak, or you're always evolving and merging, and things can become out of date, or I don't know if I heard correctly, decaying or such like that. So thinking about those things in the front end, thinking about sustainability and capacity, and, you know, and how you're going to support things moving forwards, you know, quite important. But I think that's pretty nuanced. Again, it's not my wheelhouse by any means, my area of expertise. So I don't know how much more I can add to it at this point, but we're happy to follow up, and we've got folks certainly within Portage and maybe even some folks that are here. I know lots of colleagues are present. If anybody wants to chime in, even in the chat or whatnot, to expand, feel free. And for that, we can certainly follow up for you.
No, that's great. And I think it is one of those things that requires a lot of conversations, and just, will the software be valuable in 5 or 10 years? And really thinking about, you know, what the utility is at, and kind of figuring that all out. But I think that's a good answer for the time being. Now, there is a question that's been upvoted to the top. It's about Indigenous data again. I'm just going to read it off. I haven't had a chance to vet this one, but the person said that remembering that Indigenous organizations or communities are not always equal partners, often they are the lead partners. We are working with them to support the work they have chosen to do. So it can be hard for them to fill out all the forms when the decisions are being made appropriately by elders, First Nation councils, and not by the PI. And so while this isn't necessarily formed as a question, I think it's a really good comment in terms of how you can support that. And I might give that to you, Matthew.
Sure, and I haven't talked, although it's very related to our conversation, about the Tri-Agency strategy to support the development of or strengthening of research and research training capacities within Indigenous communities. But this is an initiative across all 3 agencies, being realized in different ways. And part of that is opening up new opportunities for Indigenous communities and organizations to be the lead on research projects. Often the lead partner has been the university, but we are trying to create new opportunities. And as I mentioned before, that means we need to rethink some of how we run the adjudication process. And to help us do that, we have a number of committees we're developing, and we'll soon have a Indigenous Leadership Council. We have Indigenous Advisory Committee looking at exactly at merit review processes and how the agencies can ensure that their merit review processes are fair to the greater variety of applications we will be getting in. And so absolutely, we have a lot of interest in seeing Indigenous communities and organizations lead on more and more research. And the tools and the requirements that we have for research will need to be appropriate to their specific context. And we are striving to get the advice and direction we need to ensure that will indeed be the case.
That's great. That's great. And just noting that we are coming to hour, and just wanting to thank everyone so much for their questions. And please do reach out to us if you have any additional ones, and apologies if we didn't get to your question. And I will pass this to Jen to softly land this vessel.
I will do my best. Thank you so much, Nick. So many people to thank for this session today. Nick for hosting the Q&A session, Matthew and James for their great presentations and for their answering of all of these questions. As they've said, they are open to hearing from you if you have further questions. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks as well on the back end to a couple of my Portage RDM Alliance RDM colleagues, Beth Kazook, Kelly Stathis, and Robin Nicholson for helping support this as well. And to our wonderful interpreters, Joseph and Anthony, merci beaucoup encore. We will be back here tomorrow. Not quite the same channel, it'll be a different link, but same time with our webinar on data deposit. If you haven't already registered, you can do so here. It promises to be another great event. I will be getting the slides out links to the slides, because the slides themselves are kind of big. So links to the slides out to you. All the fonts will be readable, I promise. And having videos up on the Alliance YouTube page as soon as possible. It's a bit of a busy week, so it might be a bit of a delay, but as soon as I can, those will be out as well. And in the meantime, have a great rest of your Monday, and we will, and a FAQ link too. Yes, I'll be compiling a list of the links from the chat that have been sent out. Have a great rest of your Monday. We will hopefully see most of you tomorrow, which is Tuesday, and we'll learn all about data deposit, and we'll just carry on down this road of figuring out what's going on with this policy. I think we made big steps today. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.